Okay, thank you all for coming along. We're going to start now. So what I'd like to do first of all is I'd give you a chance to introduce yourselves for anybody who doesn't know who you are, which will be very few people. Give a little bit of introduction and then we'll have a chat. Who would like to go first?
I was going to say Simon a little bit now.
Hello everybody. Hunters. Anyway, lovely to meet you all. I'm Lee Sullivan. I still am allegedly a comic strip artist. I started my first comic strips with Transformers back in about 1987, something like that, on covers for the UK comic. And then I managed to blag my way into doing comic strips, and my life has been a massive ruin ever since.
Hello, I'm Simon Furman, and one way or another I've been associated with Transformers almost from the very get-go. I think my first meeting with Sheila Cranner, who was the editor of Transformers UK, was just into '84, so I think I could just about say 40 years. So yeah, it's been a long journey and many iterations of Transformers since, and I'm still currently working on Transformers, mostly for games at the moment, but yeah, it really does never end.
Magic. Can you see me with this one? Okay, so we're sitting talking about Transformers being 40 years old, right? So Simon, you've just gave me kind of the answer to the first question was, when did you kind of first become aware of Transformers? You know, I might look a little bit older, but I don't remember Transformers, but I remember getting my first Transformer. But I'd love to know from you what kind of what was your awareness of Transformers, and how did you then go, this is something I'm going to be involved in?
Yeah, as I said, I was just a jobbing freelance writer at the time. I'd worked on a comic called Scream before that for IPC, which closed after 15 issues, sadly. And really I was just looking for freelance script work at the time. I'd done some writing for Scream, and my editor on Scream, Ian Rimmer, had moved over to Marvel UK and was editing Captain Britain Monthly. He reached out to me because he knew that Sheila Cranner was looking for UK writers for Transformers, which I'd never heard of. And I went over to meet Sheila. She gave me photostats of the US Marvel issues, some toy pack art, some other bits and pieces of character profile from Bob Budiansky, and just basically said, go away and come up with some self-contained story ideas that don't interrupt the flow of the American material, which we are also reprinting. So, it was just, I had no interest particularly, other than it was work and I was happy to have it. But obviously, gradually over the years, it became something much more to me than just a job.
That's interesting, because this thing of, I can remember a time when Transformers didn't exist, and then I vaguely heard that there were these toys, and I just thought, kid stuff, And then I found myself, I was introduced to the Marvel guys by John Higgins, who was a great comic strip artist, and he worked as colourist on Watchmen around about that time. And he was very good at taking people under his wing, and he took me into Marvel UK's offices in London, and I was introduced to Simon and Ian. Were you both editing at the time? Or? Yeah. It was quite so coloured. Ian, he took one look at me and then went somewhere else. His career he wasn't having any of that. Anyway, I turned up and I started doing covers because I'd done I was a commercial artist doing advertising, and I was doing I could control an airbrush, and I was a big comics fan, but I hadn't got any samples of comics at all. But they took me on for some reason. And I did a lot of comic covers for the Transformers thing, which was great fun. And then eventually, Simon, I'll get that story another time. But I can remember looking at the toys and thinking, wow, what the hell are these? They're very strange. And I was 28, 29, something like that when I came into it. So I was way past the age of having toys. Any new toys. My man cave is just full of Thunderbirds and Daleks and all that kind of stuff. But I could get the idea that because I was a fan of toys and of comics and stuff when I was very young, I was really pleased to get into that world, and Simon graciously let me do a comic strip, and that changed my life really. It got me to exactly where I wanted to be, the effect was shattering meeting Simon, and I lost all my hair for one thing. But it's interesting. I couldn't get I couldn't really understand the Transformers because they were little and they were big and there was all kinds of strange stuff going on. And then I bought, because I just felt I should get into it, I bought Hot Rod, a little guy about this sort of size, which I still have at home, at Christmas for myself in a sad way. And my dad and I and my uncle, we just sat there for the whole Christmas day playing with the thing. It's like a Rubik's Cube, transforming back and forth. And I really got it. I really thought, I understand. I still couldn't quite get how they got big and small, but I felt either Megatron was like this really light, blow away in the wind robot, like 40, 50 feet tall, or he was an incredibly heavy gun, you couldn't pick up, he just fall down off his shoulder. But once I got it, and the thing is, I always knew that the audience one day would grow up and be you guys, and so inevitably it's happened, and that has been the nicest thing about it, because I knew that we were working on this thing that nobody really regarded at the time. And especially some of my contemporaries sort of used to say, you don't really want to be working on Transformers, that's for kids. As if comics aren't for kids. I think people forget that sometimes, that all this stuff is actually for kids, and we just happen to be kids that have never stopped being kids. That was my introduction to Transformers. I'm sorry, it's gone on some.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because we had a steady migration of artists throughout the course of Transformers UK, mostly because a lot of the people who came on to draw Transformers just wanted to draw comics. They wanted to draw superheroes, or they wanted to draw Judge Dredd. So we were often a kind of, a passing through stage for artists. Yes, a springboard, that's it, yeah. So, we always needed a rollover of new artists, which was great. And that, in a way, that really kind of made Transformers UK its identity, because we had such a range of different artists on it. It never looked as, the American side of things, even when they changed artists, they tended to keep the style quite similar.
So plodding.
But we had everybody from Lee to Jeff Senior to Jeff Anderson to wobbly Dan Reed. So there were all sorts of styles, and we gave launch pads for artists like Barry Kitson and Brian Hitch, who really went on to sort of take 2000 AD and America by storm. So it's great, really, looking back, the range of artists we had on the strip. So that's kind of great. And then we had this rolling influx of new artists, which was also brilliant.
That's got an interesting point, and when I was chatting there, I was thinking about, as you said, you've pretty much been involved with Transformers from the beginning, and you've never managed to escape it yet. That aspect of, for you having a new artist come on board, how did you find that transition, going from one person to another? I've heard you talk about certain artists where you're like, I know last year, talking with Andrew Bellman, you kind of just know, Andrew, that you don't really need to have much direction, but I'd imagine if you've worked with somebody for a long while, you kind of get that, and then you start again with a new bit. Do you adapt your style or your stories to kind of go, well, I know that Lee will draw it this way, so actually I want to see that, or do you kind of hope that they'll adapt to you?
It wasn't so much that. I tended to write stories, just the story. We never knew who was going to be drawing them, very rarely. did we have that luxury of knowing.
It wasn't that organised.
No. And we were on a weekly turnover. We rarely had artists doing 2 consecutive weeks. We were lucky if we could do that. So, no, I never wrote them for one particular person or other, but when I was editor and I was assigning artists scripts, I would sometimes look at them and say, well, I think that will suit Jeff Senior because it's very big kinetic action.
That's all of them.
Yeah. But no, not always. And, and often, if you look at any of the story arcs, you'll find there's 3 or 4 different artists on the longer ones. We didn't have that, it would have been beautiful if, say, we could have given all of Target 2006 to Jeff or all of Time Wars to Lee, but it just didn't work that way. We had to mix and match and use whoever was available and hadn't defected to Marvel DC 2018. So yeah, no, it wasn't really tailored for the artist, but I did look at them and think, well, that might be better as a Lee one. And I think one of Lee's first jobs actually was a story called Salvage, and I knew Lee could draw photo likenesses really well, and we decided in a strange roundabout way we were going to put Richard Branson in this Transformers story, because at the time he was...
Richard Branson, shock!
Yes.
Best line in a comic.
Because at the time he was doing a Keep Britain Tidy campaign or something, and it was loosely connected to that. But it was just a blatant attempt to get some extra publicity for the comic, which we did get. It wasn't flattering, but we did get it.
It wasn't flattering.
No, all publicity is good publicity, but Time Out were very rude about our...
and NME.
Yes, yeah. So, again, that was one where I thought, well, this would be perfect for Lee, because, if anyone could do a good Richard Branson likeness, it's Lee.
Well, actually, it's slightly back the other way around. I don't need to correct you, but this is one of my memory of it, is that the script said a Richard Branson type, okay? And I, just because I'm literal-minded and a bit stupid, I just drew Richard Branson in the rough, and then because it was the rough looked like Branson. They cooked up. Then they went off and got creative and said, "Oh well, maybe it should be Branson." And my memory is you approached his office. He denies this, or at least the office deny it now. I think when they were trying to do research for the reprints, they tried to ask him. He did at the time because he's publicity shy, quiet, individual, doesn't want anyone to know what he's up to. And he just said, "Yes, I'll be in Transformers," and so that attracted a lot of attention from me. Like the NME, which I was buying at the time, it was my Bible of music at the time, and they called it crap comic Transformers, crap kids comic Transformers. You've got to be careful what kind of publicity you get, but it doesn't matter because that particular drawing was really hugely influential for me because I'd done a likeness. Because they got permission, and so I did a proper likeness of him. Richard Starkings, who was overseeing the comic range at the time, the boys' comic range, gave me he was going to give me a Doctor Who story anyway, which is where I always wanted to be, doing Doctor Who comic strip. And he shuffled them round so that I got 7 Doctors story and some companions, dead companions as it turned out. And because I could do the likeness, he gave me that. So I suddenly catapulted from not drawing comic strips in 1988 to in 1989, I think, doing a Doctor Who 25th anniversary story. And it was just amazing. It was all because of Richard Branson. I know my entire career. Thank you, Richard.
That's a good address the story.
Amazing, it's true.
So obviously, we talked there about you moving through the artists, and it was really interesting. I would never have thought about it like that you would have just been like assigned to different artists. So that's what it was like in the 80s. We know that you have been in Transformers thereafter. In the newer IDW or Dreamwave or any kind of publishing companies after. Did that change, or are you kind of still in the, you kind of don't know who you're going to be drawing, or I think when I'm thinking of like Regeneration 1, that setup is, this is who we're going to bring in, this is who we're going to go through it. Is that a kind of different way of working now?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, Regeneration 1 was always conceived, originally it was just meant to be a 6-issue thing, as something Andrew and I were going to do together. There was never any other artist attached to it because we wanted it to be this continuation of issue 80. We just wanted that sense of continuity. So the only reason IDW agreed to do it was that both Andrew and I would, be back on that. But I mean, sometimes it's just beautiful luck. Transformers '84. We'd already understood that Guido Guidi could do other styles. He came on to Regeneration 1, and although he still drew as Guido, his stuff didn't jar with Andrew's at all. And so we thought he's a great fit for trying to make the first one, which was a one-shot, look a little bit like old Marvel US. And so I think the success of that led to the little 4-issue series that followed. And that's just one of those happy accidents. And I think when I do work with an artist like Jeff Senior, who I've worked with many, many times, there's a relaxation in that because I trust Jeff. I know he understands. I understand what he wants to draw. There's no point me giving him 2 guys in a bar talking for 6 pages. Yes, that's right. Yeah, because he's just not the right artist for that. So I know to sort of make sure if we're going to work with Jeff, it's a massive, big space opera things with dragons and explosions, basically. But I recently worked with an artist called Martin Stiff on 5 Points, which is my little original crime noir graphic novel, and I'd seen Martin's work on a thing called Tiny Acts of Violence, and it's kind of slightly noirish style. Definitely suited what I wanted to do with 5 Points. So, I sought him out. I knew Martin anyway, and said, "Would you like to collaborate on something?" So sometimes it's the subject matter that steers the choice of artist, or just someone like Andrew or Jeff that I'm very comfortable working with, and I've worked together many times with. Is there anything you can put on
No. No, it's the interesting thing about it's very nice if a writer does write things to tailor to you. The one I can remember most was really enjoying was the Time Wars finale, because I got to dismember Galvatron and his eye socket, his eyeball flew out, and I just thought, I can get away with this because it's a comic, and we did. But I mean, if you had any kind of kids' comic with an eyeball flying out at that stage, Marvel UK would not have published it, or anyone. So it was kind of interesting. But another thing I can remember, which is nothing to do with any of this, but I got reined in a bit. There was one thing I was doing which people got a bit fed up with, was I was giving them teeth. The Transformers got teeth, and snarly teeth. I was obsessed with them having teeth, really, and I just really liked drawing them. It's kind of like little loops. And so I think we need to ease back on the teeth. I don't know if it was you or Steve or someone said that, but funny little things you remember.
Would the Transformers enjoy going to the dentist? That's the next question. Thanks for that. So we touched a lot about on Regeneration 1. It'd be remiss of me not to talk a lot about that. So that was 10 years ago that you kind of got the chance, and I've heard you say it before, a lot of the Transformers comics never really, or the arcs, even at Dreamwave, never really got finished. The Transformers and that. This gave you the chance to finish it, and you said there it was 4 issues, and then you got to 14, 16? Because you got to issue 100, didn't you?
Yeah, it was something like that.
Yeah,
I mean, in the end, it actually the 6 issues kind of suited us in a strange way, because it was a nice, tight story arc. But when they decided they wanted to marry it up with the 100th issue or 200th issue of G.I. Joe and All American Hero, which was they were also publishing. So we weren't going to turn down the work, but it suddenly meant that
The sharp intake of breath.
a 6-issue arc had to become, nearly 20 issues, and then there was a 0 issue and a 80.5 issue and everything else. So it ended up a lot bigger than we thought it was going to be. But it just meant we got to pull in all those slightly Generation 2-ish elements that wouldn't have been in it otherwise. We had a much more defined, proper end to the thing, and it just got overexpanded, I guess. But I think in the end it was still fun to do and fun to actually bring to a final definitive. This is the end of this storyline.
Definitely.
Thanks very much. Lee, so kind of thinking on that, there'll be story arcs you wrote and drew, and we spoke about how you maybe never got to draw them all. Is there any that kind of stick back going, I wish I had got to finish the way that story was done?
I don't think so. I can't really remember anything where I thought, I should have had that story, although that's generally my attitude throughout. I don't understand why I didn't do any of those episodes. But it was good, and I really enjoyed my time on Transformers. But then I got kind of whisked off to do RoboCop in the States, and so I would, in an ideal world, I'd still be doing Transformers, and I'd still be doing Doctor Who, and I'd still be doing RoboCop, and I'd still be doing Rivers of London, and I'd still be doing William Shatner's Tech Work, all those things. But you just move on to another project, and then you're away from it, and sometimes you're away for a long time, and sometimes forever. I came back to do Armada. That was a thing, and that was strange coming back to it. But it was it was kind of also like you've never been away, and it must be like that for you on almost everything you've done.
It's now. You almost wonder, how many stories you've got left in you after Transformers. But I think the answer is always there's more, and I still have ideas for other things, and I would love to at some point, get back into the Transformers comic side of things. But having said that, working on the games at the moment is incredibly satisfying. It's really enjoyable. It's a different way of working. It's very team-led, but generally, with Earth Wars, this little saga that we started 7 or 8 years ago is still going, and it's this monumental thing. And their initial cast has grown to hundreds of Transformers, and it's just every bit of that story has been written by me over the last 7 years.
This is what I've always been amazed at with Simon's ability to, because in the old days when we were doing the UK comic, it was fitting in because it was every week. It used up the material from the US comic really quickly, and you had gaps, and that the UK comic started to fill the gaps in that. But I could never understand how Simon had the capacity to take all those comic strips that were actually out there and then create a story which dovetailed into it, but also didn't interfere with it. But the thing that then became more obvious was that he could just grasp all these characters, and you just said, you're working on hundreds of characters. How on earth do you hold them all in your head?
I think it's just 40 years worth of working on it. But then every now and then, I will find a character I haven't used. In Transformers 84, we used Punch Counter Punch. He was a character I'd never written, I don't think, before. And I ended up really loving that character and thinking, I could do more with this character. So, that's the great thing about Transformers. There's so many great characters. You're going to hear from Bob later on, but, when Bob created that original Bible of characters and profiles and strengths and weaknesses, he made them so sort of self-sufficient and interesting that it made all the writers who followed jobs easy, because he did all the hard work, and all you had to do was cherry pick some characters. My first story, The Enemy Within, I just looked at these character profiles and applied that fish out of water scenario to it. So who's the worst person here to meet this person there in that setting? And and that story, I've probably recycled that storyline many times of just taking the right character and putting them in the worst possible situation that they've got to deal with, which is, it's almost like the most interesting stories come out of that, when you sort of, and Bob would just go, look, his weakness is water. Okay, right, he's going to get dunked in the ocean, and have to fight the sea cons.
It's in for a soak.
So, it's just that. It's just, I think Bob did a lot of the legwork on Transformers, and, a lot of what it is now is based on that original, folder of profiles he went away and did over one Thanksgiving weekend. So, quite amazing, yes. Yeah, he tells the story better than me, so I should that point.
Wow.
Thanks very much for that. It does, it was, again, I'll thank you, Simon, for putting us in touch with Bob. It was an extreme privilege to have that conversation with him. And I think that conversation before we did the interview, and you'll get to see the interview. I want to chat about, and you talked about it as well there, about the moving to the US and working with the US kind of bit. There's cultural differences to the UK and the US. What was it for you working with the UK comic scene to then dealing with the US? What was the kind of difference for it?
Okay.
Well, it was different. The nice thing about working for the UK was that there was a little community. Somebody gave me that word earlier. Community, the Spanish people, they gave me that. Yes, you. I'm picking that in. Community of artists and writers and editors. You could go into the Marvel offices at Redan. Is it Redan Place? Yeah. Okay. And apart from the crane crashing into the building, which is a great story that Simon should tell you at some point. You actually had contact. You could go in and meet your editors, and then there were also once a month there was a pub convention. It still is actually, but a Valiant Trooper, which it was called then, the pub in London, and we used to kind of assemble there one Thursday a month, I think, and everybody could kind of chat and kind of shoot the breeze about stuff, and editors could get to know their artists a bit more and vice versa. And that was a really nice thing. When I went over, it didn't last that long really, because the offices moved and it all closed down, and Marvel UK imploded and all that. It had this enormous boom and then it went poof, and that was a shame. By then I was already working in the States then. Because Richard Starkings, whose hand moves mysteriously across the face of the universe and moves people into positions, he's very good at that. He gave me my first Doctor Who, and then he went over to the States and was influential in getting me RoboCop to do over there. And that was great to work on an American title. I didn't really enjoy it that much because suddenly I wasn't able to ink my own work, because they're so into having pencils done by one person, inks done by someone else, and colouring by someone else, and I didn't really respond well to that because for some reason I just don't do very good pencils. I can't be bothered with pencils. I do roughs these days, and then I just go and do artwork straight onto them. And that's the enjoyable bit for me. And I had to labour a way of doing pencils and didn't really like it much, and the inkers couldn't really make much of it, and everyone's disappointed then. And it wasn't until, actually, because you came in on working on as writer on RoboCop, and at that point the new editor, Rob Tokar, we were sufficiently under the radar then for Rob to get away with giving me inks to do. And so suddenly I was able to do the artwork I really wished I'd been doing, 15 issues before. Also working with a writer I knew, and poor Alan Grant, who started it, hated every moment of it. It wasn't the stories he wanted to write. There's lots of, he just really didn't like it. And so we suddenly had a really good team just before we buried it, but once we got on, but we actually produced really good work on Robocop. It really came together, but it was because it was more of a collegiate thing. It was more of a, we all knew each other, and we went to see Rob and took him to various bars. Sometimes he came back from them in a taxi. But talk about that. So that was the main difference, actually. It was the feeling of being part of a community that I really liked in the UK. And sadly, that time has never really come back. Not for me, only very intermittently with various groups. But you're usually working at a remove from people anyway. But that was the one time we all we could meet up. Everybody made a really big effort to sort of see each other on a regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, it was similar for me. The UK was a big, friendly community that we all knew each other. It was smaller. But when I went over to One Marvel US to write the American Transformers comic book, I was lucky in as much as I also at the time had 6 months in New York. I had somebody's flat to sit for 6 months. Richard Starkings again, sort of the hand of Richard Starkings. And so I did actually get to, this was when you could hang around the Marvel offices. I don't think you can these days, but it was all very relaxed in those days. And I used to just go in many days and sit in Don Daly's office, and Bob would be around, and we just hang out and then go for drinks afterwards. So it was very much like for like in some ways at first. But then, it's difficult. It's difficult being in the UK and working for the US. And when the industry, Marvel and others, imploded a bit in the mid-90s, we all lost our work in the UK, bar a few people.
We lost our editors.
We lost our editors, we lost loads of titles were cancelled. Robocop was one of those casualties. And it was a shame with Robocop because all those problems that Alan had experienced, I think Orion, the film company, were very...
idiots.
Yes, but they were very sort of, it has to be this, it has to be watered down, which really shouldn't have been. But funny enough, by the time I joined with issue 12, they lost interest in it. And so we just started telling the kind of Robocop stories we wanted to tell. And we had about a 10-issue or 11-issue run.
Yeah, that's good.
So anyway, it was great. I mean, my ambition was always to work for Marvel US. So once I had my foot in the door, I was very happy.
And am I right that when you moved to Marvel US to do the US Transformers, you touched on it, the aspect that the US was going at one pace, the UK was going so much quicker, and you're then trying to dovetail in. When you went over to the US, you were kind of doing a bit of both. How was that challenge of dealing with? You've went from this weekly comic to not weekly comic, and you're having to kind of slow your pace. How did you find that change?
It was interesting because I did have an idea when I picked up on the Marvel US series that I might, cross over slightly between the two stories. But at the time, I thought we would be continuing doing 11-page, mini sort of epics or small, big stories over 4 or 5 or 6, 11 pages. And I thought, well, that might work with the timing thing. But then, almost as soon as I'd started that with, I think, Race with the Devil, which was originally envisioned as a 22-page story, and was only later broken up into 6 and 5-page chunks, I thought, great, I can do this, until suddenly I couldn't, and we were doing 5-page black and white stories, which just wouldn't gel with a monthly schedule in America at all.
Oh, I hated that period.
Yeah, so it was just a difficult time, and I rapidly gave up on that idea of trying to cross over between the two, and just did our own version of Unicron, Galvatron, and everything else that had played so well in the UK comic.
That's great, thanks very much. Now, we talked there about the aspect of the different working styles from the UK to the US. What you'll also have went through is the different styles or different ways of working, that aspect of being in an office, to the digital era, to 5 Points was self-published. through Amazon, am I right? That kind of you order it and then they just produce it, so you don't,
Yeah.
let's do it on a base. How's that kind of different to what you were used to, back in the 80s when it started?
I mean, the one difference for me was that when I went to work on Transformers US, I had to work what they called Marvel plot style rather than full script. In the UK, we wrote full scripts, which is every panel, all the dialogue, page by page breakdowns. But in the US, they had a way of doing it which was pages 1 to 3, pages 4 to 5, and it's just a block of what happens in that, maybe with some dialogue suggestions built into it. And I'd never worked that way, and I just thought, well, this is I don't like not having this amount of control, the control freak I am, sort of.
Exactly.
And so you never quite knew what you would get back with Marvel plot style, because
I don't understand that at all. It's just mad. They made a film like that. You just end up with rubbish.
well, but somehow they made it work, I suppose, for all these years. But it was a strange for me having to change into this different style and let go of the sides a bit and trust the artist, which sometimes worked really well. And again, it really helped when on the US we started giving Jeff Senior work on it and Andrew Wildman, because it didn't matter whether I was working Marvel plot style or not. We just fell into the same patterns that we'd always worked in. So it was only sort of for a few of the artists in my run that I had to get used to that. But yeah, everything else I did for Marvel was plot style, which was strange.
I'm very grateful I never got into that, because I really like, I've always seen my job really as an illustrator. Okay, that's how I think of myself. And comics is one form of illustration, and advertising is another form, and covers are another form. But I always felt like I'm illustrating what a writer wants to convey in his story. So for me, the script is everything. If I don't get the script, if I don't get enough script, I don't know what it is they want, And I would much prefer I was working to, even including dialogue. I hate, the idea that you wouldn't have the dialogue to work from. It's just a nightmare. God, that's so much extra work. You just have to think about. I don't know. I'm glad I didn't get involved in it, but
even down to where the characters stand in relation to each other, I think it's just weird.
a lot of comics, to me, drawing comics, is about choreography, because what you're doing is you're taking, even with a fight, but if you've got a scene where like 3 guys are talking to each other, and it takes 6 panels for that, the order in which they speak governs how you represent them. So you have to revolve those 3 characters around to the right combination, so you can get them speaking left to right, top to bottom. And it's crucial to me to have all that stuff. Otherwise, it's nonsense, because then the writer has to look at what the artist has got and say, okay, so he's speaking first now. It may not fit what he has in mind. And so I'm a big fan of writing to script, and my main task is to try and get what the writer wants onto the page. That's my job. I've never really understood it when these jumped up artists in America, Johnny Americans come and would lead the story. And I just thought, well, that just seems mad to me. The writer is the king. I've always said to Simon.
Thanks for that. Okay, so we're going to have the interview with Bob later on. Bob told me to tell you that you still owe my pint. You'll always owe my pint.
Oh, yes.
But I want you to kind of think back. It's been 40 years. There's numerous characters. I like that aspect you talked about, like kind of punch, counter punch. Just really, like, how many characters do you have in your repertoire that you've wrote for? But I'm going to kind of throw it to you. Either can I ask you to give me your favourite character to write for, or is there one you haven't written that you know of that you go, I'd like to do something with him, or even somebody that you're like, I touched on him, but I'd like to do more. And then the same for you, but for Colin.
No, I mean, I think probably over all the various things I've I've written for most of the characters. I mean, probably some of the newer characters I'd like, that have sort of come out of the later sort of versions of IDW. I think, there's some characters there I like to. But even with that, Earth Wars, those characters are popping up in Earth Wars, and so suddenly I'm writing for Flame War or Nautica or some other, so really Earth Wars kind of is the catch-all for this. But it was like, when because we can do almost what we like with Earth Wars, it's almost like Hasbro don't look at Earth Wars. I drop all sorts of in-jokes and little sort of asides and sort of breaking the fourth wall bits into Earth Wars sagas. And when Flame War is introduced, one of the characters shouts, "By the Ben of Ye, it's Flame War!" Probably completely over Transformers, but Ben Ye created Flame War in one of the 3H comics, and that was, I just thought, hey, I'm going to give Ben his credit here for Flame War, and also nobody will know except the fans. They'll get the reference. So no, I don't think there's many. I mean, I'm sure I will walk away and then there'll be another assignment, and I think, I need that character for this story, and I've never really written Double D, although he's in Earth Wars as well. So it's there's probably someone somewhere out there I haven't written for, and I'll get around to them.
I can't speak to the later stuff because I wasn't invited back to do them. Two things. One is that I really like putting in jokes into the comics if I can. And they might be for the fans, they might also be for fans of other things to pick up on. So we did one of the stories involved I think it was Octagon, something like that. Is that a name that's right?
It's not that, but it's something.
It's something like that. But he's like, basically he's a Dalek. That he transforms into a Dalek, and if you look at him, you can see he's got the potential to do that. He's got the slats and then fold back head, which has got a round top, and so all his arms have got the little sense spheres on them, and so I was always doing things like that. But my favourite character really was Galvatron, because I always like to assign, if I could, the characters an actor, that I liked. So. Optimus Prime was always Adam West in the original Batman TV series Batman, because he was so serious. And okay, chum, you're going to have to kill all those Decepticons, but in a kind way. So he was wonderful. But the one I really latched onto was Galvatron, because I just thought he was Jack Nicholson from The Shining. So he was like, "Here's Johnny." And I loved that picture over there. That's that one I'm holding up. That was basically when I started to realise he could be Jack Nicholson. So I gave him the eyebrows, and I really enjoyed that. I didn't really have any kind of, but I think Galvatron was great because he was just off. He was unhinged, so you could do anything, and you could make him you could make him funny and make him serious and nasty all at the same time. And I thought that was a really great combination of things. Whereas, this is apropos of nothing. We were talking at the breakfast with some guys, we were talking about funny names which aren't allowed anymore in Transformers. One of which was Slag. You wouldn't get Slag now, because it's a term of abuse, But I always thought it was really funny that the one female Transformer was called Arcee. And that's strange. It's a different world. It probably wouldn't happen.
Thanks very much. Now, so Transformers isn't all you have done. You've obviously done other stuff, apparently. I'd like to kind of hear from you what you've enjoyed working on and what you're working on now. People can kind of find your work in. I know you're obviously doing some. You're always doing Transformers anyway, but what else have you got on the go these days?
Well, right now I'm working on a new sort of mecha series called Astrobots. The first 5 issues series has come out. I think the trade hits in October and then the second series starts. And that's rolling on and on. We're working on the third and fourth arcs for that now. So, and the toys are very amazing, you know, if you haven't seen them.
What are they?
They are robot toys, but they're very articulated, and, you know, incredibly so. But yeah, I mean, so there's Astrobots. I'm trying to do some of my own self-publishing, 5 Points, To the Death. Martin and I are still starting to work on a sequel to 5 Points. A second, you know, Detective Mackey case, and then that's balanced with, you know, a lot of game stuff. I'm doing Earth Wars. I've recently worked on Earthspark Expedition, the game that came out from Outright. That was fun to do, and I'm working on a big, you know, sort of like console re-game now for Transformers that I can't talk about anymore, and I probably shouldn't have said that, but
Have they buy them drinks later?
and then, I mean, on top of that, it's just whatever else. You know, I still write whenever I can for the Treasury of British Comics, so I've been doing Leopard from Lime Street recently in Monster Fun. I've just done I did a Leopard from Lime Street meets the Spider, or fights the Spider, that was in the Treasury of British Comics annual last year, and this year's will have another sort of team up from those classic British heroes.
Is the Spider the guy with the black in the hook nose and the rather strange chest?
Yes, that's it. Yeah, that's him. And so, you know, it's just always a mixture with me, and yeah, you know, I mean, I hope at some point, and there's one or two things, you know, smouldering in the wings, that I hope to be doing some comic work in the none too distant future on Transformers.
For me, I suppose the last few years I've sort of done a number of things. I did a thing called Rivers of London, which was for Titan, and that was based on Ben Aronovich's novels, a supernatural detective series, a police procedural kind of thing. I did 4 very intense years on that, 6 graphic novels. It was a real killer. But I'm really proud of that. I think it's probably the best work I've ever done. Then I went on to I've just come off a 2-year stint on Doctor Who magazine's strip. I did a 14th Doctor, the exclusive 14th Doctor story in that, which also featured 1 million Daleks, because I got known for being a Dalek artist a long time ago, and so it's come back to haunt me. We did 14 episodes of that. Alan Barnes must have nearly gone completely crazy doing the script for it, and I nearly went completely crazy because he was throwing in all these Daleks and crowd scenes and things set in an adventure playground. Oh God, I'm a very lazy artist. I only want one thing to do at a time. You know? One person talking there, and then another person talking there. But he'd never give me that. He gave me loads of crowd scenes. And then I did the 15th Doctor first story, and then I've left sort of temporarily, but maybe not so temporarily, depends how it goes, because a friend of mine is called Jamie Anderson. He's the son of Jerry Anderson, and he now runs Anderson Entertainment, which looks after a lot of the these days looks after a lot of the publishing of the Anderson stuff. If you don't know the Anderson stuff, it's a puppet series from the 1960s. That's a very broad generalisation, but that's when I grew up. That's when I was reading that particular comic, TV21. He is now publishing all of that stuff in a series of anthologies, because the 60th anniversary, Transformers, the 60th anniversary is rolling round of Stingrays this year, Thunderbirds is next year, Captain Scarlet the year after that. And as each year rolls past, there'll be a series of anthology books, which I am adding very cheekily, because there are these giants of comic industry in Frank Bellamy and Mike Noble and the Embletons and all the rest of it. And I'm coming along, standing on the shoulders of giants, doing little comic strips, which are all part of a bigger idea, which I can't talk about either. And so I'm back to being 8 years old again. and I'm drawing Stingray at the moment, so that's really good fun. And little 8-year-old Lee would have just been amazed to think that he would be drawing comics directly based on those things and actually sitting amongst them. And 8-year-old Lee would also be saying, "But what took you so long? 60 years, man. How long?" So, you know, it's proof that if you hang around long enough, I always use this analogy, if you hang around outside a restaurant, you know, looking a bit shady long enough, someone will drag you in and give you a meal, you know. And that's my whole career. So, you know, I've been doing these wonderful things to do with things that totally, you know, Doctor Who's and Anderson were pretty much my childhood. I never really worked on Star Trek, but then I did work for William Shatner. So that was that's pretty much absolutely where I want to be around about now. And I'm amazed and grateful that in the twilight years of my career, I finally got where I was going.
And, you know, and it is that way for me on the Treasury of British Comics stuff, because they're the comics I was reading and characters when I was a kid. You know, Valiant, Lion, all those stories. You know, Robot Archie and the Spider. They were the superheroes I grew up with. So yeah, it's pretty much like, damn, what else is there to, you know, what other mountain is there to scale here?
I've achieved everything.
I know.
Thank you very much. Right, so we'll probably get time for like one or two questions. Guys will be up there, you can go up and ask your questions to them directly, but is there anyone who'd like to ask a question while we're up on stage? And you can maybe get to it and go, I'll come back to you in a second. Right, so we're going to go 2 questions. I see 2 hands go up.
After coming from screen and doing some of the Transformers stuff, did you ever want to go darker with stories?
I'm not sure I could have gone much darker with the Transformers stories. You know, with Scream we were utterly limited by IPC management who wouldn't risk us going into anything more than slightly creepy. You know, we weren't allowed to do very much with Scream, and I think that's why they were quite happy to see it cancelled after 15 issues. But we
Really?
yeah.
They just didn't like the idea of it.
No, they instigated it and then were scared of it.
Oh no, it's a horror comic.
Yeah. I think they were fearing there'd been a comic called Action just before that. They'd had a big backlash in the sort of Daily Mail press that we were corrupting the minds of children, and they feared Scream would get that same reaction. So, but no, with Transformers, you know, I never limited myself in terms of darkness. I mean, because they were robots, you know, we did things and told storylines that I don't think we could have got away with in a different kind of comic, with human beings and superheroes. And, you know, we were talking earlier about Jeff Senior's art, and everything Jeff drew just looked violent and visceral. You know, so you just couldn't, you know, there was
Very
no
much
getting
like
away
himself.
with it. Yeah. You know, I still remember in Target 2006, there was one scene where I think it's Scourge throws a bit of sheet metal across a warehouse and it embeds in Hoist's chest or something like that. And you know, and the way Jeff drew it, it was just like, oh dear, you know. But you know, nobody seemed to mind because they were robots.
Did I really write that?
Yeah.
We'll do one more question and then we'll have a break.
You got me thinking when you mentioned Richard Branson, and I'd forgotten about that, and it got me wondering, because I remember the UK comic was quite British in its terminology. You know, you had computers called auntie and things like that, and I remember there's lots of phrases used in battle and elsewhere that I'd imagine when you then started writing for the States and taking over that side, maybe wouldn't translate the same way. So what I was wondering was there a point where you thought you had to check yourself quite a lot in that way of thinking when you were writing?
I mean, I don't think I was ever conscious. By the way, Auntie, before I go on to that, Auntie, that name actually came out of, it was a name that was removed from the original US treatment. So
Oh, really?
yes,
Oh,
that name,
right.
I don't know whether it was, I think it might have been for the arc itself.
Right.
Why they called it Auntie,
Yeah.
I don't know.
They don't use that.
But you know, because we got the treatment, and you know, back in the days, it wasn't just we'll output a nice clean version. It was the treatment with scrawls all over it and things crossed out. We were going, oh look, they had the name Auntie in there. You will use that as the computer, you know. And then only later did I give it a whole acronym in
Made
Regeneration
it
1.
work.
Which was
Oh God! Don't ask me.
somebody will know. Somebody will know.
And, what was I saying? No, we didn't. You know, I wrote. I'm British, and we were writing for a British audience, so I never really thought I'd got to write in Americanese or anything.
Yeah.
You know, Demolition Derby may have been set in America and involved a demolition derby, you know, but it was written like they were all British, and you know, and the characters, probably the Transformers spoke like they were British as well. So no, I don't think we ever tried to. I mean, Optimus Prime, we tried to make it sound like Optimus Prime, actually, but generally no, we didn't check it for American.
I've got one.
If there are any children listening, you have to cover your ears now. But the thing that used to amuse me was that the other way round was you would look at American comics. There was one I saw. I think probably Greg Wright was responsible for it, but there was some sound effects which I thought were really funny. And again, they didn't translate well to British, and it was a whole load of dustbins being thrown and crashing into people, and the sound effect was wank.
Which of course for Americans meant nothing at all. You know.
Sluts as well.
Yes, that's right. I mean, famously, Phil Collins, when he was in Miami Vice, used to just say wanker all the time, and nobody on the set knew what he was saying, really. He just thought, well, that's something quaint and British.
Oh, brilliant. I think that was a really good way to end. So,
It's early yet.
thank you so much, Lee. Thank you so much, Simon. The both of them will be up available. Come up, ask them a question, buy some of their art. Thank them for all their hard work in the Transformers. We also have Lee Bradley up there as well, who's got some outstanding artwork as well. We're hoping we can talk, provided everything goes well next year at a time, we'll hopefully bring back Lee to have a proper chat with him. But please go up. But before we let them off, I think it'd be a good chance to say a massive thank you to both for their contributions and for coming today.